Hey guys, welcome back to another One Room Schoolhouse. As we are looking at the beginning of the school year, one of the things that certainly we recognize is there are going to be a lot of things that teachers are telling students that might not be the most historically grounded and accurate. One of the things that we have done at WallBuilders for a long time is try to help present history that a lot of people don't know and take it back to the original sources. So we tell people all the time, hey, don't take our word for it, go look this up. We actually will point you to those sources on our website. We have a lot of articles, we have a lot of resources there to help uncover some of these stories. But one of the very foundational things that I think is overlooked for a lot of academia today, something we used to do in early education was helping students learn how to think instead of what to think.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In the way that, especially in the Founding Father period, teachers would encourage their students to do that is through asking questions, right? Not just taking and just learning to memorize whatever the teacher says, but actually kind of engaging in that conversation, that back and forth, that inquisitive nature, which helps lead to actually people searching out truth for their own. You know, where did you get that? How do you know that? What does that really mean? How does this work? What does that look like? Things of that nature. And so as we go back and look at some of the early textbooks in the founding era, we see much more of this teaching people how to learn instead of just what to think.
Yeah, so one of the things that we can point back to is Isaac Watts, who was a famous hymn writer from back in the day, wrote a lot of songs that probably some of us would recognize, not the least of which being Joy to the World. But Isaac Watts was somebody who not only wrote a lot of hymns, this is a little textbook called The Improvement of the Mind. And in this textbook, he actually is helping walk students through learning how to think. Now again, what to think and how to think are two totally different things. In most modern education today, we're telling students, hey, memorize this, repeat this, and so they're being told what to think, not how to think. And actually, maybe not even what to think. They're being told what to memorize and repeat, what to regurgitate. And this is where you have a lot of indoctrination that even becomes a possibility, because instead of students learning or being taught that you should ask questions along the way, you should challenge whatever the status quo is to make sure that's a defensible position, make sure it makes sense. We're not teaching students how to be critical thinkers and problem solvers. We're teaching them to memorize, repeat, and regurgitate. And you know, Jonathan, even when you mentioned that asking questions was something foundational in early America, it reminds me of some of our friends over in Israel. We have one of them who, when he was an ambassador over in America, pointed out that, you know, as Americans, you guys, when your kids come back from school, you ask questions differently than we do. He said when a student returns home from school, an American parent says, well, what did you learn at school today? He says, as a Jewish person, he says, I don't think, what did you learn? He says, what I ask my kids is, how many questions did you ask in school today? Because the more questions they ask, the more engaged they were in what was going on, and the more they're in turn going to learn from it. But this notion of asking questions is something certainly that not only is there a foundation historically, we could point out biblically it's a foundation. It's interesting though, going back to something like this. So Robert Troop Paine, one of the founding fathers, he wrote this memoir, and it deals largely with some of his education when he went to college. And now, back then, there was only 8 levels of education. And levels are different than grades, because levels are a little bit like a video game. It doesn't matter how old you are when you start the video game. You have to beat level 1 to get to level 2. And it doesn't matter how long it takes you to beat level 1, right? You could be 16 years old starting level 1, and it took you 2 years to beat level 1. Well, that's just what it is. You could be 4 years old starting level 1, and it took you 3 days to beat level 1. It was much more an education about content mastery than it was about how old you are, and based on your age, you go to the next grade. So they cared about content mastery. In an early education with only 8 levels of education, they would often finish between the ages of 11 and 13 years old is when they finished with school. And they, at that point, thought, okay, and parents would told them, now you need to get a job, move on with life. And it was not unusual from about 13 to 16 years old. That's when many students went to college. Robert Troop Paine went to college when he was a very young teenager, and this is a memoir about some of his experience at college, but it's interesting what he points out, what the professors taught him and the questions they asked him even at college.
Yeah, so he has a section that's kind of called forensics, and obviously when we hear forensics, we think, you know, something like NCIS or one of those police shows where they're in a lab, but back in the day, forensics really referred to more something along the lines of like debate, right? We're having these discussions and arguments, always civil, but reasoning with each other, going back and forth, the pros and cons of certain arguments. And he actually includes in his memoir kind of a list of these themes, of these forensic questions that they're going through and discussing and being asked in class to argue kind of both sides of, so that you have a full understanding of the material for and against. And by the time that you get out, you really know what you believe, why you believe it, and also you have these methods of learning so that whenever you encounter something in the world, you're able to think critically and rationally about it.
And this was something that he's doing this as a very early teenager. And it's something that, right, in this course, it was very common for freshmen to take a course like this. And actually, it's something that if you look at some of the classical model of education today, they have logic that's part of the courses they do in classical education model. And this is kind of the idea behind that, but it was logic combining with public debate. And what they would do is they would pick a topic that would seemingly be morally ambiguous. So they wouldn't say is murder right or wrong, because that's a very clear moral issue. But one of the questions he says they would ask is there more danger in believing too much or too little? Well, that's a super ambiguous question, but that was the point. That each student would have a time, and so you might have a minute and a half and you're going to argue in favor of this, and another student have a minute and a half and they're going to argue against it, and so they would have to learn the strengths and weaknesses of the argument and be able to highlight that for their side, and at the end of a set amount of time, the teacher at times would even have them switch sides, so what you were just arguing in favor of, now you're arguing against, but what it was doing is helping you learn critically to think through the issue so that you were learning to evaluate, is this smart? Is this foolish? Does it make sense? Is it right? Is it wrong? And this is literally one of the things they were doing as a freshman in college. Now again, freshman in college back then was different because they were 13, 14, 15 years old. So this is very young people going through this. But imagine where we are now today with whether we talk about the promotion of socialism for young people. And so many people are buying into this notion of socialism, which of course for us makes no sense whatsoever, because we can point out historically no nation that's ever embraced socialism has ever increased the prosperity for the citizens, that it's never increased the freedom for the citizens. Every single nation that's embraced socialism, those citizens have lost prosperity and they've lost personal freedom. This is a devastating scenario for any nation, and yet we have so many kids embracing it. Why? Because they haven't learned to think through the strengths and weaknesses of the argument. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it right? Is it wrong? What do we think about this? And this is where, as we're looking at education today, one of the things that certainly we would encourage everybody watching, you need to learn to start asking questions. Of course, parents who are watching, this is something they can start helping their kids learn to ask some very basic questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And even in today, especially in college and in high school, a lot of times people are penalized for asking questions because it's taken as, challenging authority or the status quo or whatever. But you really need to be able to ask those questions, even if it might be a little scary at times. And oftentimes there's a way of asking it where it doesn't necessarily on its face come off as, challenging or antagonistic. But some of the questions that we encourage, especially the students who come to our college programs, to ask is, whenever a big, bold statement or claim is made, like socialism is good, it's just being like, well, how do you know that? How do we know that it's good? Where's your source from? How are they reaching the conclusions that they're reaching? And just starting kind of to open up that discussion on like, well, where does it work?
Yeah, so this is where we're asking for proof of the claim they're making. And what's important about this is if someone is making a bold claim, like socialism is the best system of economics in the world today, or if they say all the founding fathers were racist and slaveholders and they were all evil, or America is systemically racist, if there's these major claims being made today, the impetus is not on you to prove those claims wrong. The impetus is on them to prove it right because they're the one making the claim. They're the one making that statement. So you don't need to show why what they're saying isn't true. You can just ask them some very basic questions, and when they're put in the position of having to defend their position, many of these very bold claims that are being made are not defensible when it comes to just the reality of life, when it comes to historic document data and information. And so this is where if someone's making a big claim, right, one of the first things we say is, well, how do we know, right? And what we're looking for is what proof do you have? And what we really want to know is what source is your information. Because if you tell us, well, we saw it on the news, we saw it on social media, right? Like
I read it on history.com.
Right, some major athlete just tweeted this out, therefore that's how I know this. Well, that might not be the most reliable source to base our position on. And so we want to make sure that we're using a good source. For example, if someone said all the founding fathers were raging alcoholics, which is a claim being made, as crazy as that is, well, we say, okay, so how do we know they were? Because maybe they were. And one of the things that's also worth noting is we want to ask questions not as gotcha questions. I want to ask questions in pursuit of truth because I always want to stand on the side of believing what is true, regardless of what that looks like. So if it's true, then I'm going to say that's true. That's what happened. That's the way it was. That's the way it is. Maybe the way it should be. Whatever the case is, I want to know what's true. And so if, in fact, the founding fathers were all raging alcoholics, I would love to know that. But if someone's making that claim, I'm not just going to say, oh, well, okay, some professor said that. It must be true. I'm going to say, well, what proof do we have? What source do we have? And actually, they might go back to a historic receipt.
Yeah, regarding this claim in particular about the founding fathers being all raging alcoholics, like you mentioned, that is actually what people are saying in the college classroom, and it goes back in this particular instance to a Huffington Post article that was posted a few years ago where it makes this claim, and it bases it off of this one alleged document that they know of, that the Huffington Post, this major historical organization, found, where basically it was after the Constitutional Convention. George Washington took out some of the military guys to party. Allegedly. And the receipt from that evening has just an unbelievable amount of alcohol. And so if you were to parse that up between all the people that were there, I mean, each person there was drinking X amount, and it was just a crazy time for all those that were there. Now, note, the professor in the classroom said all the founding fathers were raging alcoholics. When you even just read the article, the only founding father that's there is George Washington, allegedly, and then a whole bunch of military guys. And so when we were very interested in this, and so we started looking more into it and was able to track this receipt down to all the way back to 1950s. Which is interesting, because if you're talking about a founding father incident and the oldest surviving document that anybody has pointed to is from the 1950s, that should already raise some red flags. Like, why do we not have the original? Why is it only this document from the 1950s that we can point to?
Why is nobody else writing about this? Because in that era, that would have been a conversation, right? If Washington goes off with his military officers and they're all getting plastered drunk, like, people would have written about that. They saw this, and this, our commander-in-chief, and like, this would have been a big deal. This would have been in newspapers, but there's no evidence of it anywhere else. Here's the point, is if you just ask some very basic questions, you realize, like, oh, this is the only source you have? Okay, probably not the most credible claim there is. And this, again, is where we would point out the impetus is not on you to disprove the claim. The impetus is on them to prove their position to be correct. And this is why we encourage asking questions, because questions can help you lead to where the truth is. And right now there are so many things being said. And maybe during a series of One Room Schoolhouse coming up, we can spend some time going through some of these accusations and debunking some of those claims just with historic documents and data. The point is, most students are being fed information and they're being told, memorize this is true because I told you, that's why, write it down, it's going to be on your test. And they're not learning to be critical thinkers or problem solvers. They're not learning how to think. They're being told what to memorize. And we want to make sure that in the midst of, now we are in a culture in America where there's a lot of people that literally despise America. There's a lot of Marxist ideology, people that are pro-communism, pro-Marxism, that want to see America fundamentally destroyed and changed forever. We want to make sure that those people are not being able to promote lies that are not historically grounded. So we're going to encourage you, in the midst of what's going on, ask questions. If you have actually questions that you would like information to, can't find it, go to the WallBuilders website. You can reach out to us. We'd be happy to help along the way. But the bottom line is, as school is coming up, make sure that we are pursuing what is true and not being misled by things that are not accurate. And one thing that also we can point out is, if you want a good resource, it's a little crash course through American history. We do have a book called The American Story. It's available at wallbuilders.com. It's on Amazon, pretty much anywhere books are sold. And you can get a crash course through a lot of American history, starting with Columbus, going roughly to the end of slavery, 1,000 footnotes in the back, taking you back to original documents and sources. So this is where we would encourage. The most important thing is going back to the original, going back to the actual document, because that's where you find truth. Not just what some teacher says, not what some professor says, not what some woke culture is telling us. We want to know what is true. So we encourage you, as this school year is coming up, and maybe you're already in school right now, ask questions. Don't just believe everything you're told.